Okay, so what is video? Oh. Right. So what is video? Well, let's talk about a quick recap of how we see, right? We see by scanning, our eyes move around the scene, we transmit, we interpret, and we store. We haven't talked really about the other, well, we've touched on the other issues, transmit, interpret, restore. We'll talk about those in more detail today. But this is how we see. We see what we scan. So, wide screen. We see the world wider than it is possible for our optical eyes to see because our head moves around and fills in the scene. We transmit information to our brains through thousands of optical fibers simultaneously in bold, because this is an important difference between our eyes and cameras. Human vision uses a bunch of channels, right? So we transmit information parallel, meaning that information is traveling beside information from source to destination, right? Computers do this as well, like computers do. They transmit information across internal buses from processor to graphics card and graphics card to monitor, et cetera. There's all these different parallel systems going on in a computer. All these signals are interpreted by our brain, turned into visual data, and they represent the whole scene. So understand that we scan, we transmit, we interpret, in that we make a picture out of it. It's not a picture when it gets to our brain, it's data, and the brain has to turn that into a picture again, based on however the brain is structured. And we get the whole scene, right? Keeping in mind that our brain and I paint the scene a region at a time, meaning that this graphic isn't the best. It's more blobby than this with these little squares, but I probably should have made a graphic myself, but I stole this, borrowed this, downloaded this off the internet. But basically, we look at chunks of the area in front of us. So the building in the far left, the building in the center, the ground in front of us, and in no particular order. Like, our brain isn't scanning the scene around us in any particular way. We're just sort of moving our head, right? Now, if you're walking, there's probably some rationality, your brain looking down and up. So there probably is some kind of order there, but generally we just kind of look around randomly. And as we see things, we paint up this entire square frame in our brain, right? We don't, and of course there's no square in our brain, but we paint the whole frame in our brain out of the image. So if you can imagine, for example, you were blobbing paint on a wall with a brush, and you go blob, 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 and do the whole wall until the whole wall is painted, as opposed to stroking left and right and up and down, right? The brain holds images in two sort of memory registers, if you want to call it. There's that short term right now, which is what you're experiencing as the moment is happening. And then there's the memories, which are, I don't know how to put this. They're not an interpretation of what you saw, but they kind of are. They're not actually what you saw. If you can think of it more like a computer, if you want to think this way, they're more like the instructions of what you saw. All right. So, and that's the memory, which is why memory is imperfect, and which is why, for example, eyewitnesses are unreliable, because people can be conditioned through any number of reasons and ways to remember things incorrectly, right? And that includes visual information. So when you're, if you're looking at eyewitnesses to a crime, for example, and you're confronted later with an image of someone who they say, is this the person? You might go, sure. But not because that's the person, but because it has some features familiar with the person that you saw, but at the same time, there's a suggestion going on right now with the person you're dealing with next to you that this is the person. So you just say, yes, it is. So there is that long-term memory as well, which is not as accurate as the short-term, right? So unlike vision, which is a parallel process, video is a serial process. Funny joke. Mike makes a joke. And what that means basically is that everything's coming at you one frame at a time. And not only one frame at a time when we're talking about a camera, but video is coming at you one segment of the frame at a time, a specific segment at a time, right? So for serial, so if we look at these images here, this is Muybridge, Edward Muybridge. And he created, well, there's a lot of argument about what exactly went on here, but basically Muybridge was trying to settle a bet. And the bet was that a horse's feet never, all 4 feet never leave the ground at any one time. They're always 1 foot on the ground. And this was based on intuition. Be in a situation where they're not touching the ground. They're so heavy, they must have 1 foot on the ground to transmit the weight to the earth, right? But as we know, people can jump. But for some reason, the idea was the horses, it's not that they weren't jumping when they walked, I shouldn't say, because horses did jump. But anyway, when they walked, there was a bet made that horses' feet never leave the ground. Muybridge developed this series of cameras. And so what you're seeing on the frame is, let's see, there's 16 frames, and these are 16 different cameras. And each one is 1 instant after the other. There's trip wires, and the trip wires, the horse would trip the wire and open the shutter. And then you'd get these instants one after the other. So from top, excuse me, from top left to bottom right is the reality. So if you take those individual frames now and run them side by side, it looks like it's moving, right? And you can see, if you look carefully in the bottom right hand, or probably bottom left hand corner, you can see numbers changing. Those are the numbered frames from 1 to 16. So here we have it. And of course, he wins the bet, the person who bet that the horse's feet never leave the ground, because in frame, I think it's frame 2, I can't, can I stop this on that frame? Yes, maybe I can. Oh, there we go. Frame 3, horse is off the ground, right? No feet are touching. So back to what we're talking about though. So for images to work in our brain, it has to be looked at, it has to be presented to us as though it's all happened at once, right? So just in case I lost you, because I might have, because I sidetracked onto Muybridge for a second. Mechanical reproduction, and that includes electronic reproduction, is a serial process, which means the reality is occurring one item after another. And in this case, I'm showing you frames, but it actually works right down to the level of pixels. It's 1 pixel after another. That is not how our brain looks and sees. Our brain is seeing in those blobs I talked about. So the human experience is not the same as the video experience, but we can fool humans by changing things fast enough. And in this case, 16 frames per second-ish, we can start changing things fast enough, and our brain will make it look like it's actually live motion, right? Okay, but our brain can be fooled, okay? So here's an example of motion. And if you look at this, you guys can see this, I imagine. You can look at the subway train heading into the tunnel, or is it heading out of the tunnel? Or is it doing both? Is it switching back and forth? Well, that's the trick. It isn't switching back and forth, but it looks like it is, because there isn't enough information here for our brain to make a completely coherent image, right? There's only 2 or 3 or 4 frames, and I don't think I have the ability, I might have it, yeah, to stop it. But all you have to do is move these frames back and forth a little bit, right? You can probably see that. It's hard. This doesn't really work frame by frame. There's only 3 or 4 frames here. And so here, I'll go back to making it move. So if you, excuse me, without a proper amount of information, the brain interprets, right? So now it's taking what you've given it and it's trying to make sense out of it. And then you get this illusion. And this, by the way, not this particular frame, but that is the idea behind all optical illusions. You give the brain just enough information to make it start trying to build an image, and then you change it or withhold it or do whatever, play tricks with the rest of the information, and it confuses our brains, right? And it's because, yeah, so I said this already, it's because we try to make sense of things. I mean, we're not born knowing we're going to be fooled. You know, we're born and conditioned to think that the reality in front of us is the reality in front of us. This is what makes so much media so powerful, because we are perfectly suited to be fooled. You know, humans are perfectly conditioned to be fooled because we take everything at face value at the beginning. We later on question it as we get mature or we get educated. We begin to realize, for example, when you see this, if you watch this enough times with the subway train, you start to see the trick. And you start to see, for example, this door here, where is it? Oh, where's my cursor? The door here, this red door, go back and forth, back and forth. The average person is not seeing that, right? And that will break the illusion. And then now what you see is, instead of it moving one way and then changing, going back the other way, you might just see it going back and forth, because now your brain has figured out what maybe is going on, right? What is one of the mechanisms that help us fool ourselves? And one of them is persistence of vision, right? And the idea here is that you have an image up long enough for the brain to put it into short-term storage, the now, as I call it, before the next image comes up and makes it appear as a continuous event, right? So let's put that on its head. The short-term image is actually short enough so that the following image looks to be continuous reality with the first image before it, right? There is a point, and I'm not sure if scientists have done it, but you've probably seen it already. If you've ever seen any overcranked video, 48 frames per second, 120 frames per second, it starts to look unnatural. It's too many frames, and they're not quite sure what's going on there yet. There's still a lot of studying being done into the illusion of high frame rate video. But suffice to say that after about 16 frames, higher than 16 frames, and somewhere the sweet spot is somewhere around 60 frames at the other end, anywhere in that kind of bracket, motion looks fluid enough for the human brain to interpret that as some sort of reality. As I say here, a continuous event. It's probably a better way to put it, because we know it's not reality. And this is, by the way, it's called the flicker rate. And the flicker rate is when that transition occurs from still pictures to moving pictures. So the flicker rate is variable depending on people's brains, because we're not all the same. It happens somewhere around 16 to 20 frames a second. So you can see, for example, that motion pictures, which were traditionally shot at 24 frames per second, they simply found the lowest frame rate that they could find to eliminate the flicker, right? And in fact, the reason that films were called flicks and flickers was because that before they had settled on 24 frames per second, films ran at anywhere from 10 to 20 to 30 frames per second. There was no standard, when they first began. And so they were called the flickers because these slower moving films flashed in front of you. You saw the flash, and therefore they were called flickers or flicks, right? The thing to keep in mind here is that the reason that 24 frames was chosen early and not higher is because film was expensive. And so the lower the frame rate, and that's still a thing in a way, we'll get to that later on, but it's still a thing that we want to have a lower frame rate because of cost. In the case of today, the cost is more in data than dollars, but if you have a high frame rate, you've got a gigantic data storage to deal with. So you want to try and shoot at the lowest possible frame rate for your project, ideally say, right? And for film, it was 24 frames a second. And it has been that way now for over 100 years. I don't know what that slide's trying to tell us, except that maybe this is a walking animation. And basically, animators discovered the same thing early on, that you could find the right frame rate and make people see things moving, right? But I'm not sure what this slide has to do with anything. All right. So the important thing to remember is that in order for this whole illusion to work with the persistence of vision, is that adjacent frames must be closely related in time. All right. If a frame, like in this 4 frames from Alien, we go from Ripley to the cat. If that change occurs, the brain will notice something's wrong and wonder what's up. Now, when I say that, you kind of maybe chuckling to yourself, well, of course it's an edit. Remember that editing was invented when film came along. There was no editing of video before film. Reality just happened. There was no, if you closed your eyes and looked and opened them again and things were different, that was a trick. I mean, babies will still do that. If you close if a baby closes its eyes and you leave the room, or you disappear and they open their eyes and you're gone, they'll think that's a joke. There's something, because their brain will laugh, that, they will laugh because there's something not right with that. So in order for this persistence of vision to work, the frames have to be closely related. All right. And if they're not, then we think something's up. So further to that, when you do an edit, you always, and I don't know if Dave Barenbaum has talked to you about this yet or not, but there's always, you have to leave a moment to breathe. And I put breathe in air quotes. So when we cut from Ripley to the cat, the whole scene has changed. We're in a different place. Now, this may be, in this case, it's in the same room, but it might be in a totally different environment, right? So you've got to give viewers a chance to reorient after an edit. So always leave a little bit of a breath, what we call a beat. I don't know if you guys have talked about this yet with your editing instructor, but Always leave a beat when you've made an edit. Don't just, unless that's your style. So someone like Edgar Wright, for example, is famous for not leaving beats, right? They do this sort of what they call a smash cut almost, where you just cut from action to action to action to action, which is fine, but it's tiring. Even Edgar Wright knows you don't do that for very long, right? And part of the value of being a sort of a professional is you realize that we'll do those kinds of effects for maybe a few seconds or a minute, and then we'll go back to kind of the regular pace of editing, because people's minds just need time to cope with what's going on, right? But it can be very funny. And again, Edgar Wright uses it for humor. It can also be very terrifying. You can do a smash cut from, you know, someone's eyes to a bloody weapon and scare the crap out of people because their brain doesn't know what's going on. You've changed the complete scene's different now. What's happening? Where are we? Right? So anyway, we've sidetracked a bit onto editing, but that's kind of what that's all about. So what is video? Well, it's an illusion that mimics real motion. Sure. Is it a series of images? Sure. It's not film. Sure. You know, any other ideas? I mean, by all means, video is really what you want it to be. And this is an important thing to remember, video/film. The whole idea of innovation is not to copy the past, but to create the future. I know that sounds kind of cheesy, but how can I think about this? I don't want to sound like an old guy, but I might when I say this. So for example, in songs, when you get a lot of modern songs that sample older songs, it's kind of okay, you know, hey, that's cool. They're sampling, I don't know what they're sampling, you know, 1960s Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, whatever they're sampling. But the problem with that is that you can only do so much by changing ingredients in the recipe. If you're going to go forward in a big way, and I got to admit that sampling's had a good 20-year run of this sort of technique, starting way back in the 90s and beyond, when they were first sampling, to today, when, you know, there's a whole industry built around licensing music for use, et cetera. And that's the music example. But the trick is, if you're going to go forward and be unique, you've got to have to develop your own style. And so we all start out by copying. I mean, I did, everyone does, right? But eventually, if you're going to be somebody, you have to do one of two things. Either you copy the past in such a way that you synthesize something new out of it, which is entirely valid, or you have a completely new path that you've created. An example of that one would be Alfred Hitchcock, who did things that no one had ever done before. You know, and you can talk about a number of directors, for example, who've, or even editors. You know, we don't have to get into directors per se, and even cinematographers. Let's be honest, who create new visual language, right? Everyone kind of, maybe not everyone, a lot of people imagine that the visual language for film and video started being created back when the media began in the 1890s, and then never, after that, we created a few things and that's it. No, it's a constant creation, right? So video can be all kinds of different things. So keep that in mind. But what is it really? It's really just pixels, right? So to come back to the media technical fundamental, it's really just pixels, the picture element. Pixel, okay, is what a pixel is. It's a picture element. And even though here we're seeing RGB pixels, you know, not all pixels look like this. This example here is showing you a pixel. In the black square is 1 pixel, and the 3 stripes of color are subpixels, and we'll get to that when we talk about pixels. So a pixel is just a picture element. It's the smallest element of the frame that will create a whole image. In other words, even though there's 3 subpixels here, together they're a pixel. Alone, they're not a pixel. Okay, so a pixel is not the smallest potential element makeable. It's the smallest element that will create an image. And in this case, to create an image, we need all the colors. And again, we'll get to that down the road, so don't worry about that today. Images are built up pixel by pixel. So remember I said that it's a serial process. A pixel is essentially a dot with a given size, position, color, and brightness value. We start at the top left conventionally. There's no reason for that. And in fact, if you look at interlaced video for analog NTSC television, one of the frames, one of the interlaced portions of the frame starts at the top left, and the second one starts in the center at the top. But in today's digital world, we've defaulted to the top left of the frame. So that's pixel number 1. And then as you go across from left to right, the numbers increase. And then as you go down the rows, the numbers increase until you get to the bottom right, which is the highest So in the case of HD, that bottom right pixel would be number 1920 by 1920-1080, right? Or whatever the 1 million, whatever the number is of pixels in the frame, if you were numbering them that way. And we'll talk about how we number pixels and stuff later as well, not to worry. Okay, pixels actually have one color. So keeping in mind that color pixels are actually built up of subpixels, as I said earlier. RGB pixels have 3 subpixels, 1 for each color. Okay, and that's because we have RGB system, which has 3 primary colors. And we only need to have 3 pixels to express those. Pixels are lined up into rows. So you will occasionally hear about lines as well as pixels. Lines is more of a term for analog television because analog television didn't use pixels, it used lines. We've broken those lines up into pixels when we went digital, but the lines were, if you think of a continuous line, left to right without the little blocks, like it's hard to imagine because we don't have an image of it, and it's hard to find images, I'll be honest, of individual analog video lines, but there was 525 lines of data. The difference between analog and digital, of course, is that analog information can constantly change. Digital information has to be calculated. So it would be very difficult to do digital pictures as lines. And we'll get into that again later on this term, all right? But pixels are lined up into rows, top left, bottom right. The lines make a frame. So we're building up now. So if we go back, just in case you kind of lost what we're talking about, we're starting out with pixels, the squares. We start out with how the pixels are arranged in the screen. One full screen of pixels is called a frame, right? I know it's an obvious thing, but you got to remember this because there'll be a quiz. That's why I'm telling you this. Remembering that there's also fields, which we'll talk about with interlace. The quick sidebar onto raster. Raster sidebar. A raster image. What is a raster image and what is a raster? So a raster image is an image that is defined by the number of pixels or lines. Okay, so HD, JPEG, MPEG, 4K are all raster image formats. If you've done some work in Photoshop and you import a graphic and you go to do some work on it, and Photoshop pops up a message that says, you need to rasterize this image before you can proceed. Yes, no. Understand that when you say yes, you are fixing that image's resolution to the number of pixels that you've chosen. All right. So what that might mean, if I repeat it again, because it's a bit of a thick concept, is that a raster image is defined by the number of pixels forever. So once you've rasterized an image into a particular resolution, that resolution of that image will never change. You could change it, but you'll deform the image, right? So if you take an image and make it HD, and then take that HD, you rasterize an image into HD, and you make that HD raster image 4K later, you're not going to get more resolution. You've got the HD image you started with, and you're deforming the pixels to make them larger, to make more of them, make more of them, all right? So a raster image, if you're dealing with images that are not rasterized, and we'll talk about that in a second, you have much more flexibility, right? 3D, for example, 3D is not rasterized. 3D is using vectors, shapes, angles. So I don't want to get too far down this road because it can be quite confusing, but 3D images are built up using polygons, shapes, measurements. And the measurements are relations to each other. So there's a lot more calculation in 3D because every time an object moves in 3D, you've got to recalculate all the relationships. As a raster image is just simply a pixel. It's a flat, think of it as a printout. It's a flat frozen image on a piece of paper, on a pixel, done, right? So you cannot res up a raster image. So the point for that is if you're going to use something in 4K later, start with a 4K image. Sure, you can down convert it to HD if you want an HD version, but when you go to do your 4K version at the end, you'll have that high quality 4K original image to refer to, all right? So that's a bit of an editor. Yeah, and this is what I've just said here, right? So if you shoot in 1080, 1920 and you res it up to 4K, you'll have the same information, but a crappier picture because it'll soften a bunch of the corners. It'll add a bunch of artifacts. We talked about artifacts, I think, and if we didn't, we will. It'll add a bunch of extra things to the image that you don't like, and you can't get rid of them. All right. Okay. Any questions on that? That raster thing can be a little bit confusing. No? Yes? Oh, I've lost my chat. Why does my chat keep going away? Uh-oh. My mic levels are fluctuating. This whole time I've been talking. My mic is fine now. I hope. Well, I'm gonna have to go back. Let me go back and check that. I might have to revoice some of that if it's really crappy in the recording. So now the recording might be delayed. Boo. Anyway, the raster thing, just to remember that when you build an image out of pixels, you're making what's called a raster image. So now you know, if you didn't know before, what rasterizing is, what a raster is. The raster, if someone refers to a raster, they usually mean the image frame, if I can call it that. It's like the pixels, but they're empty. You know what I'm saying? The digital image is the image electrified and then counted and sorted. And what that means is we take the image off the camera sensor, we convert it into electricity, and then we do some mathematics to that electricity and make a digital signal out of it. All right. So how do we do that? Well, in analog, well, I guess there is a bit of analog here still. In analog, we do it by altering the voltage and the current of the sensor based on what it's seeing. So the sensor captures the image, and it will change voltage for brightness. Things like that will happen. Voltage values will change for brightness, etc. And that is the analog method. And then in digital, you do those same first steps with the voltage and current changes, but now you immediately capture them as numbers, right? And now you have a digital signal. So just a bit of sidebar trivia, all digital cameras start out analog. As soon as it's captured on the sensor, it's analog, and then it's digitized. So the very first thing that happens in a camera, even today, is an analog video picture is built up, and then it's converted to digital right there on the sensor. Or in the sensor, not on the sensor, in the sensor. All right. So imagine you're describing a scene, right? You've got to provide various descriptions of data. Now, again, we're still talking about the definition of video. So in video, you need to have brightness, color, which colors, how intense, right? Where is the start of the picture? So in other words, where is top left? Where are all the pixels located in the frame, right? So the numbering system we have to number all the pixels. When does the frame happen? So when does the frame begin being made? How often does it happen? What's the frame rate, right? These are all the things you have to ask. Oh, there is a bit of analog here still, of course. So the analog image is that instantly varying in proportion to the image. Photons are converted in quotes into electrons. Electrons represent the photons is more accurate. And light values are converted into electrical values. So we have the voltage for brightness, frequency and phase for color. So you know that power, if we're talking about voltage, we're talking about power, and power has a frequency component. So for example, 60 cycles per second is the wall frequency, but we can alter that frequency in a camera to whatever we need because cameras are battery powered. And we can change the phase of the power from 180 degrees to 0 to 90, whatever we need, in order to represent color, right? So we can manipulate those inside the camera, excuse me. Then you have an on-off pulse in analog to start the picture and another pulse to show the start of a line. So once an analog image is electrified, it can be digitized using binary numbers. You can assign numbers to the electrical values. There's no data other than 0 and 1 in digital. There's just 2 values, lots of numbers. And for example, there's 186 million numbers per frame in uncompressed 10-bit 4K. All right.